The dust tasted like copper and pulverized bone. It hung in the air of the collapsed Soviet bunker, a thick, suffocating cloud that choked the lungs and blinded the eyes, swirling violently in the erratic beams of tactical flashlights that pierced the subterranean gloom. Through the heavy, distorted static of a shattered earpiece, a voice screamed. It was a raw, ragged sound, tearing through the baseline hum of the battlefield, stripping away decades of ironclad military discipline to reveal pure, unadulterated terror. "Harper, fall back! That is an order! You'll die!" The voice belonged to Master Chief Silas Thorne, a man who had survived 30 years of the most unforgiving combat environments on Earth. A man who had bled in the jungles of Central America, who had navigated the burning oil fields of the Persian Gulf, and who had never, not once, panicked. But he was panicking now. His voice cracked over the obsolete analog radio frequency as he watched the 26-year-old explosive ordnance disposal specialist make her final stand. In the crushing darkness of the underground concrete tomb, Harper Kincaid did not fall back. She ignored the order. She did not look at the overwhelming force of elite Spetsnaz mercenaries pouring down the central corridor, their suppressed weapons spitting a relentless wall of lead. She looked at the structural support columns of the bunker. She looked at the heavy canvas bag of obsolete Soviet MON 50 directional mines strapped tightly across her shattered chest plate. She pulled the mechanical firing device. She charged into the dark. Then came the roar. It was not merely an explosion. It was a concussive wave of heat and rapidly expanding gas that shattered the earth, bringing millions of tons of jagged granite crashing down, burying the enemy, burying the nightmare weapon they sought to steal, and burying her. Hours later, when the dust had finally settled over the unforgiving spine of the Hindu Kush, the rescue choppers arrived. The SEAL medics dug frantically through the twisted iron rebar and shattered Soviet concrete. They were not looking for a survivor. They were looking for a body to bring home. They wrapped their heavy leather gloves around the final slab of stone, heaving it upward, shining their high-lumen lights into a small, jagged void created by a collapsed steel I-beam. They froze. The hardened medics dropped their shovels. Lying in the pulverized rock, covered in a thick layer of gray dust and dark blood, her body battered and broken beyond recognition, Harper Kincaid took a slow, rattling breath. And as the blinding beam of the flashlight hit her face, her cracked, bleeding lips parted. She was smiling. 72 hours earlier, nobody at Fort Bragg had been smiling. The staging bay of the Special Operations Command Complex was a cathedral dedicated to modern warfare, bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of overhead fluorescent lights. It smelled of CLP gun oil, freshly unboxed nylon webbing, and the sharp, distinct ozone tang of charging electronics. Men and women moved with quiet, intense purpose, loading heavy Pelican crates, calibrating optic sensors, and syncing encrypted communication tablets to classified satellite networks. In the dead center of the organized chaos stood Commander Thayer Vance. He was 34 years old, impeccably groomed, and wore his combat uniform like a tailored suit. Vance was a creature of the modern Pentagon, a rising star who had built his rapid career on drone warfare algorithms, thermal imaging integration, and satellite telemetry. He looked at the battlefield not as a living, breathing entity filled with chaos and blood, but as a sterilized grid of data points displayed on a high-definition screen. Harper Kincaid sat on a cold steel bench in the far corner, separated from the digital hum of the command center. She was 26, with sharp, angular features, her dark hair pulled back into a tight, unforgiving braid, and eyes that held the quiet, unsettling stillness of deep water. She was not looking at a glowing screen. She was looking at a piece of cold steel. In her hands rested an M1911 pistol. The blued finish was worn completely away at the edges, the Parkerized metal rubbed down to a dull, handsome silver from decades of rigorous use. The walnut grips were smooth, darkened by the sweat and adrenaline of the men who had carried it before her. Her grandfather had carried it through the frozen, terrifying shadow wars of a divided Berlin. Her father had carried it through the burning, toxic air of Desert Storm. Now it belonged to her. With practiced, rhythmic, almost hypnotic movements, she field-stripped the heavy weapon. The slide racked off. The recoil spring popped out. The heavy barrel was removed. She wiped every component down with a silicone rag, her bare fingers reading the microscopic imperfections in the metal like Braille. A shadow fell over her workbench. Commander Vance stood there, a sleek, military-grade tablet tucked casually under his arm. He looked down at the disassembled pistol, then his gaze drifted to the heavy, brass-cased, lensatic compass resting next to her Kevlar helmet. A patronizing smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "You taking that museum piece to the cush, Kincaid?" Vance asked, his voice carrying just enough calculated volume to ensure the intelligence technicians working nearby could hear. "We have precision-guided munitions and constant thermal overwatch. You won't need to fight the Battle of Belleau Wood out there." Harper did not look up. She slid the heavy steel barrel back into the slide, the metal snapping into place with a satisfying, authoritative click. "Batteries die, Commander," she said quietly. Her voice was perfectly steady, devoid of insubordination or anger, but carrying a heavy weight that deeply defied her young age. "Steel doesn't." Vance let out a short, dismissive laugh. "This is a modern theater specialist. We don't rely on dead reckoning and iron sights anymore. We have a continuous, unbroken data link to a constellation of military satellites. That compass is dead weight, just like that sidearm. Welcome to the 21st century. Try to keep up." He tapped the glass of his tablet, turned on his heel, and walked away, projecting the unearned, absolute confidence of a man who had never seen his screens go dark in the middle of a screaming firefight. From the deep shadows near the armory cage, a pair of pale, weathered eyes watched the exchange unfold. Master Chief Silas Thorne leaned heavily against the chain-link fence, a steaming cup of black, bitter coffee in his scarred right hand. Thorne was 58 years old, a living relic of the Cold War SEAL teams, a man whose personnel file was mostly redacted black ink and classified addendums. He had a face like eroded granite and a body mapped with the permanent, aching scars of conflicts that officially never happened. He belonged to a fading generation that navigated oceans by the stars, survived on melted snow and sheer willpower, and knew in his bones that technology was only a tool, never a savior. Thorne took a slow sip of his coffee. He had been assigned to Vance's team as an observer, a quiet, unspoken mandate from the old guard admirals at the Pentagon who didn't fully trust Vance's absolute, blind reliance on silicon chips and remote-controlled warfare. Thorne looked at the young woman reassembling her pistol. He saw the extreme economy of her movement. He saw the way she checked the chamber, the way she respected the lethal nature of the weapon. He saw the heavy brass compass, the analog mechanical watch strapped to her wrist, and the worn, dog-eared topographical paper map tucked carefully into her chest rig. Vance looked at the girl and saw an antiquated liability. Thorne looked at her and saw a survivor. 14 hours later, the cavernous belly of the C-17 Globemaster rumbled with the deafening, bone-rattling roar of 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines. The interior of the aircraft was freezing, bathed entirely in the dim, blood-red glow of the jump lights. They were descending rapidly into Bagram Airfield, but their final destination was much further out into the unforgiving wilderness. The Hindu Kush, the graveyard of empires. A jagged, monumental spine of stone and ancient ice that had swallowed invading armies whole for thousands of years. Harper sat strapped tightly into the nylon webbing along the fuselage, her eyes closed, feeling the deep vibration of the aircraft through the thick rubber soles of her combat boots. She was actively running through the topography of the target area in her mind, visualizing the tight contour lines, the extreme elevation changes, and the natural deadly choke points of the valley. Beside her, Commander Vance was illuminated by the pale blue light of his tactical screen, his fingers rapidly swiping through live drone feeds and thermal overlays. "Weather is rolling in fast," Vance announced into the internal comms, his voice buzzing with electronic clarity in their noise-canceling headsets. But the MQ-9 Reaper drones have eyes on the target valley. Infrared shows absolutely no heat signatures in the village. It's a ghost town. We drop in, extract the intelligence cache from the local asset safe house, and we are out before the blizzard hits. Clean, surgical, and fast. The system has our back. Across the narrow aisle, Master Chief Thorne sat with his massive arms crossed tightly over his chest. He opened one pale eye, looking at Vance, then looked across the red-lit space at Harper. She opened her eyes at the exact same moment. For a fraction of a second, an unspoken, profound understanding passed between the grizzled, aging veteran and the young, quiet specialist. They both knew the same fundamental truth. The mountain didn't care about the system. The covert infiltration chopper dropped them on a wind-scoured, jagged ridgeline at exactly 3 in the morning. The cold was not just a temperature, it was an absolute physical entity. It punched straight through their advanced thermal layers and bit into their exposed skin like broken glass. The air was incredibly thin, tasting of sharp ice and ancient rock. The MH-60 Blackhawk flared its rotors violently, kicking up a blinding, chaotic storm of crystalline snow before banking hard to the west and disappearing rapidly into the black, starless sky. The sudden, immense silence that followed the helicopter's departure was oppressive. It was a heavy, dead quiet, broken only by the mournful howling of the wind tearing through the granite crags. "Comms check," Vance said, tapping the side of his advanced ballistic helmet. "Satlink is green. Overwatch drone is holding in position at 20,000 feet. We have a God's eye view, people. Form up. Let's move down to the settlement." The squad began their treacherous descent. There were 6 of them in total, Vance taking the lead, his eyes constantly darting downward to the glowing screen strapped to his left forearm. 3 young, highly fit Army Rangers flanked him, moving with the nervous kinetic energy of men implicitly trusting the invisible eye in the sky to keep them safe. Then Harper, moving with careful, deliberate steps, and taking up the rear guard, moving with the silent, fluid, predatory grace of a hunting wolf, was Silas Thorne. They moved through a narrow, winding ravine, the sheer rock walls rising on either side like the jaws of an immense trap. The snow was knee-deep in places, hiding treacherous crevices and jagged, ankle-breaking stones beneath a pristine white surface. Vance marched confidently, guided entirely by the glowing blue line on his GPS interface. "Path is clear. No thermal blooms ahead," he whispered confidently into the mic. Harper stopped dead in her tracks. She raised her right fist into the air, the universal tactical signal to halt. Thorne froze instantly, his M4 rifle coming up seamlessly to his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dark ridgeline. The 3 Rangers stopped a second later, looking around confused. Vance turned around, a flash of deep irritation crossing his face. "Kincaid, what are you doing?" Vance hissed over the encrypted comms. "My screen is completely clear. Keep moving." Harper didn't answer right away. She knelt slowly in the deep snow, pulling the heavy winter glove off her right hand. She pressed her bare, freezing fingers against the trunk of a dead, twisted pine tree that clung desperately to the side of the trail. She felt the bark. She looked down at the snow directly around the base of the tree. "The snow crust is broken," Harper whispered, her voice barely audible over the shrieking wind. "Not by wind drift, by boots. Heavy combat boots. And there's a smell." Vance scoffed loudly over the radio. "A smell? Are you serious, Kincaid?" The thermal feed shows absolutely nothing living within 5 miles of this grid square. Cordite, Thorne's voice came over the radio, low, grave, and absolute. He had moved up silently beside Harper. His wide nose flared, testing the freezing air like a hound. She's right. Old gunpowder and weapon-grade gun oil. Someone was here, recently, waiting. Vance tapped his screen aggressively, frustrated by the insubordination. The drone says we are alone. The satellites say we are alone. I am not halting this mission because an old man and a paranoid EOD tech are jumping at shadows in the dark. Move out. That is an order. Harper stood up slowly, pulling her thick glove back onto her freezing hand. She reached over her shoulder and unslung her primary weapon, a heavily modified Mk-12 designated marksman rifle. She didn't look at Vance. She looked straight up at the jagged ridgeline above them, the darkness utterly impenetrable to the naked eye. They aren't shadows, Commander, Harper said softly, her thumb resting lightly on the safety selector. They are hiding their heat signatures. Heavy mylar space blankets buried beneath a thin layer of top snow. It traps the body heat. The drone can't see through it. It's an old Soviet ambush tactic. Enough of the Cold War ghost stories, Vance snapped, entirely losing his patience. We push forward. Now. They entered the perimeter of the village 20 grueling minutes later. It was a miserable cluster of stone and mud brick huts, clinging precariously to the side of the mountain, half buried in the relentless snow. It looked completely abandoned. The wooden doors hung open on broken, frozen leather hinges. There were no livestock, no footprints, no fires. Vance led them directly into the small, open dirt square at the center of the settlement. He raised his wrist, checking his exact grid coordinates against the satellite feed. This is the rally point. We hold perimeter and wait for the asset to make contact. Harper kept her back pressed hard against the freezing stone wall of a ruined structure, her eyes scanning the dark, empty windows of the surrounding huts. Her breathing was incredibly slow, heavily controlled. In through the nose, pause, out through the mouth. Thorne moved to the exact opposite side of the square, sinking deep into the darkest shadows. He didn't look at his radio. He didn't look at a screen. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind. Suddenly the wind stopped. For one terrifying, agonizing second, the entire valley was utterly, completely silent. Contact, Harper whispered. It didn't begin with a dramatic shout or a wild, chaotic spray of gunfire. It began with a sound like a single dry branch snapping underfoot. The young ranger, standing exactly 2 feet to Vance's left, dropped straight down to the frozen ground without making a single sound. A neat, perfectly round hole punched cleanly through the center of his Kevlar helmet. "Sniper!" Vance screamed, his voice shattering the absolute silence. Panic instantly flooded his tone, washing away his polished demeanor. Before the echo of his shout could even bounce off the canyon walls, the night erupted in lethal violence. It was not the chaotic spray-and-pray fire of local, untrained insurgents. It was a highly disciplined, perfectly coordinated wall of lead. Suppressed weapons firing in precise, controlled 3-round bursts. The muzzle flashes were expertly hidden behind modern flash hiders and deep rock crevices. The enemy was using textbook bounding overwatch, moving down the mountain with terrifying mechanical efficiency. These were not farmers armed with rusty AK-47s. These were Tier 1 professionals, Spetsnaz mercenaries, lethal ghosts of a fallen empire operating flawlessly in the dark. "Return fire! Suppressive fire to the high ground," Vance yelled, dropping heavily behind a crumbling stone wall. He frantically tapped the glass of his tablet. "Overwatch! I need a hellfire strike on the eastern ridge. Paint the targets." The remaining 2 rangers opened up with their M4 carbines, pouring rapid fire into the darkness, shooting blindly at nothing but shadows and muzzle flashes. Harper did not fire wildly. She dropped immediately to a prone position in the snow, her cheek resting firmly against the freezing cold stock of her Mk-12. She ignored the deafening chaos. She ignored Vance's screaming. She actively slowed her heart rate down to 50 beats per minute. She watched the eastern ridge through her optic. She waited for a mistake. She waited for a muzzle flash to linger a fraction of a second too long. A tiny spark of light flared in the darkness, precisely 300 yards up the steep slope. Harper exhaled, pausing her breath at the very bottom of her lungs, where the body is most still. She applied 2.5 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. Through her magnified optic, she watched a heavy shadow tumble backward off the rocks, sliding down the snow. "Got one," she stated, her voice icy, calm, and entirely detached. "Drone strike incoming! Danger close!" Vance shouted, staring obsessively at his screen. "ETA 30 seconds. Keep your heads down." Thorne fired a short, controlled burst from his rifle, shifting his position to avoid return fire. He looked at the panicking commander, then looked straight up at the black sky. He didn't hear the high-pitched, familiar whine of the Reaper drone descending. He felt a sudden, deep, unnatural vibration in the roots of his teeth. Then, the modern world went completely dark. The electronic warfare attack hit them like a physical, crushing blow. It wasn't an explosive detonation. It was an absolute, instantaneous cessation of all digital life in the valley. The glowing blue map on Vance's tablet vanished instantly, leaving a dead, black mirror reflecting his terrified face. The advanced night vision goggles strapped to the Rangers' helmets let out a high-pitched, agonizing whine and powered down permanently, plunging the men into total, impenetrable blindness. The highly encrypted radios in their ears went from organized tactical chatter to a deafening, hissing wall of white static. "My screen is dead!" Vance screamed, hitting the expensive tablet violently against his palm. "Comms are down. Nods are fried." He looked up at the sky in horror. The faint, red, blinking light of the Overwatch drone, their multi-million-dollar guardian angel, was spiraling wildly out of the cloud cover, plummeting toward the mountainside miles away. The Spetsnaz had fired a localized EMP pulse, a crude, brutal piece of old Soviet technology, dragged out of a forgotten bunker and used to completely blind the modern American war machine. Vance was openly hyperventilating. The man who controlled the vast battlefield to a digital screen was suddenly trapped in a dark, freezing box, completely blind, with highly trained killers actively closing the distance. "We're blind," Vance gasped, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "We have no GPS. We have no extract coordinates. We don't even know which way the extraction zone is. We are entirely blind." The Spetsnaz mercenaries instantly realized the jamming had worked perfectly. Their fire intensified dramatically, heavy caliber rounds ripping effortlessly through the mud brick walls, chewing up the frozen dirt all around them. They were moving closer, tightening the lethal noose. Thorne looked at the paralyzed, broken commander. The Master Chief had seen this happen before. He had seen desk officers break mentally when their flawless plans evaporated upon contact with the enemy. Thorne prepared to take immediate command, to order a blind, desperate retreat deep into the uncharted mountains. It was a near-suicide run, but it was all they had left. Before Thorne could utter a word, Harper Kincaid moved. She crawled rapidly through the deep snow, keeping her head inches below the incoming tracer fire until she reached Vance's pinned position. She reached out, grabbed the front of his expensive tactical vest, and pulled him down hard behind the cover. "Commander," Harper said. Her voice cut straight through the radio static, through the deafening gunfire, through the overwhelming panic. It was the calm, anchoring voice of a woman who was perfectly at home in the dark. Vance looked at her, his eyes wide, whites showing in absolute terror. "We're dead, Kincaid. The grid is gone." Harper reached into her tactical chest rig. She didn't pull out a backup radio. She didn't pull out a spare lithium battery. She pulled out the heavy, brass-cased lensatic compass. She flipped the protective lid open with her thumb. The floating dial spun wildly for a second before the magnetic needle settled, locking firmly onto the magnetic north pole of the Earth. A raw, elemental force of nature that no electronic jammer could disrupt. No EMP could destroy. Next, she pulled out the folded, dog-eared, topographical paper map. She flattened it against the snow, shielding it with her body. She unclipped a small, heavily shielded red lens flashlight from her shoulder strap, clicking it on. The dim, analog red light illuminated the tight contour lines and elevation markers of the Hindu Kush. She placed the compass flat on the map, expertly aligning the azimuth. She looked up briefly at the jagged mountain peaks silhouetted against the night sky, performing a quick, brutal, mathematically perfect calculation of terrain association and dead reckoning. "We are not blind, Commander," Harper said, her gloved finger tracing a narrow, treacherous line between two extreme elevation points on the paper. Extraction rally point is exactly 7 clicks north-northeast. There is an old goat trail through this eastern ravine that provides hard rock cover from the high ground. Vance stared at the paper map as if it were an alien artifact from another dimension. You know where we are?" "I know exactly where we are," Harper said with absolute certainty. She snapped the heavy brass compass shut and shoved it safely back into her pouch. She picked up her MK-12. Thorne watched her from across the bullet-torn dirt square. Beneath his thick, frost-covered beard, the old SEAL smiled. It was a cold, hard, exceptionally proud smile. The multi-billion-dollar system had failed. The digital screens had died, but the soldier remained. "Master Chief," Harper called out, her voice rising clearly above the sharp crack of incoming rifle fire. "I need heavy suppressing fire on the left flank. I'm taking the point. We are moving analog." Thorne violently racked the charging handle of his M4. The sound was loud, metallic, and beautiful. "Copy that, Spark," Thorne growled, using her earned call sign for the very first time. He looked at the terrified young Rangers and the broken commander. "You heard the lady. Follow the girl with the compass, or die in the dirt." Harper rose smoothly into a low crouch. She didn't have thermal vision. She didn't have satellite support or drone overwatch. She had cold steel, heavy brass, waterproof paper, and the unwavering, iron discipline of the generations that had bled before her. She looked deeply into the darkness of the mountain pass. The Spetsnaz mercenaries were out there, waiting patiently in the freezing wind. They thought they had crippled the Americans. They thought they had turned off their eyes. They didn't realize they had just forced them to open them. Harper kicked off the wall, charging straight into the howling snow, leading the men into the graveyard of empires. The hunt had just begun. The wind in the Hindu Kush did not blow. It actively hunted. It screamed violently down the jagged ravines, carrying razor-sharp, microscopic ice crystals that stripped the heat from a human body in mere minutes. Harper Kincaid moved through the absolute whiteout conditions with the steady, relentless mechanical rhythm of a metronome. Her entire world had shrunk down to the faintly glowing tritium dial of her grandfather's compass, in the 3 feet of treacherous, uneven snow immediately in front of her heavy boots. Behind her, the mountain was literally tearing itself apart. The Spetsnaz mercenaries had pursued them relentlessly up the goat trail, their suppressed weapons spitting death into the blinding storm. Commander Vance and his 2 remaining Rangers had quickly fallen behind, their heavy digital gear and absolute reliance on dead electronics turning them into slow, terrified liabilities. When the enemy fired a shoulder-launched thermobaric rocket into the sheer cliff face directly above them, the resulting catastrophic avalanche of snow and shattered granite had cleaved the American squad in 2. Harper and Master Chief Silas Thorne were completely cut off. They had been violently pushed higher up the ridge, separated from the commander by a massive wall of impassable, jagged debris. They were entirely alone on the mountain. Harper knelt behind a jagged outcropping of black basalt rock, keeping her Mk-12 rifle raised, her eye pressed to the optic, scanning the swirling white void. Her breathing was incredibly slow and measured, a survival technique drilled into her since childhood to conserve precious oxygen at high altitude and keep her heart rate under 60 beats per minute. A shadow materialized silently through the blizzard. It was Thorn. The old SEAL moved with an eerie, unnatural silence, shifting his weight to displace the snow rather than crunching heavily through it. He dropped into the hard cover beside her, his breath pluming thickly in the freezing air. He did not speak immediately. He unslung his rifle, checking the bolt action, clearing a small, dangerous buildup of ice from the ejection port. Only then did he look at her. "They lost Vance and the kids," Thorne rasped, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the shrieking wind. The rock slide buried the main trail. If they survive the blast, they are moving completely blind. Harper nodded once, her eyes never leaving the ridgeline. "The temperature is dropping fast. We need to keep moving, Master Chief. If we stop, we freeze to death." Thorne grunted in agreement. He pushed himself up from the snow, but a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped his tightly clenched teeth. He leaned heavily against the freezing rock, his left hand gripping his right shoulder. Harper turned sharply. Even in the dim, snow-choked ambient light, she saw the dark, wet, expanding stain spreading across the digital camouflage of his tactical jacket. It looked black in the darkness. Blood. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice leaving absolutely no room for argument or rank. Thorne waved her off stubbornly. "It is just a ricochet from the ambush, spall from the rocks. I am fine. Let's move." "You are actively bleeding out in sub-zero temperatures," Harper replied, dropping her rifle to its sling and aggressively pulling a heavy trauma kit from her chest rig. "If you go into hypovolemic shock, I have to carry your massive ass down this mountain. Sit down, now." The old man looked at the 26-year-old woman. He saw the absolute, unyielding authority in her eyes, an authority not granted by military rank, but by sheer competence. He slid down the rock face, sitting heavily in the snow. Harper worked incredibly fast. She used trauma shears to cut away the thick nylon and Kevlar, exposing the ragged, ugly tear in his shoulder where a piece of shattered granite had punched deeply through the muscle tissue. The extreme cold was actually helping slightly, aggressively constricting the blood vessels, but it still needed deep packing. She ripped open a sterile package of advanced hemostatic gauze. "This is going to burn like hell," she said quietly, maintaining eye contact. Thorne stared straight ahead into the raging storm. "Do it." Harper shoved the chemically treated gauze deep into the wound cavity, packing it brutally tight against the torn artery to force coagulation. Thorne did not scream. He did not flinch. The heavy muscles in his jaw locked tight, and a single bead of sweat formed and froze instantly on his temple. He breathed heavily through his nose, a harsh, rhythmic sound, locking the immense physical pain away in a mental box that he had constructed decades ago. Harper secured the deep packing with a heavy pressure dressing, wrapping it incredibly tight. She watched his face, recognizing the profound stoicism. It was the exact same look her father used to have when the phantom pains from his Desert Storm shrapnel injuries kept him awake walking the floor at night. "Where did you learn to pack a deep wound like that?" Thorne asked, his breathing slowly returning to normal as the adrenaline leveled off. "That is field expedient, not textbook medic training." "From a man who didn't believe in textbooks," Harper answered, wiping his thick blood from her bare hands into the pristine snow. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the storm rage around them. The massive generational divide between them, the vast chasm of time and warfare philosophy, seemed to vanish entirely in the freezing dark. They were just two soldiers, stripped of all modern miracles, relying purely on blood and bone to survive. "We need higher ground," Thorne said, testing the limited mobility of his right arm. He could still shoulder his rifle, though the pain would be blinding. "If Vance's electronics are fried, Our only chance of calling dust off is an analog burst. He reached deep into his heavy assault pack and pulled out a massive rectangular piece of equipment wrapped in waterproof canvas. It was a tactical satellite radio, but not the sleek, touchscreen models issued to Vance. It was an older, heavily ruggedized unit, built with heavy analog dials and a thick, rigid rubber antenna. It is heavily shielded against EMPs, Thorne explained, seeing Harper's eyes lock onto the radio. I never go into the field without a mechanical backup. The Pentagon desk jockeys think these belong in a museum, but out here, old school keeps you breathing. Harper strapped her trauma kit away. We need to clear the heavy tree canopy and the rock interference to get a signal out to the satellites. There is a sheer peak half a mile north of here. Elevation should be enough to punch through the storm front. Lead the way, Spark, Thorne said, using his rifle as a crude crutch to push himself up. They moved out, stepping directly into the teeth of the blizzard. The incline was utterly brutal. Every single step required driving their heavy boots violently into the hard-packed ice, fighting gravity and the relentless, screaming wind. Harper took the point position, her eyes constantly shifting from the glowing needle of her compass to the treacherous terrain ahead. An hour into the agonizing climb, the snow momentarily thinned, revealing a narrow defile flanked by sheer, vertical cliffs. It was a natural, fatal choke point, the only way up to the peak. Harper raised her fist. Thorne stopped instantly, sinking into a low crouch, ignoring the burning agony in his packed shoulder. Harper did not look at the ground. She looked at the rock walls, then at the skeletal remains of a stunted pine tree that had somehow grown in the crevice. She moved forward with agonizing slowness, her eyes tracking an invisible line in the dark. She knelt in the snow, reaching out slowly with a bare hand. Her fingertips brushed lightly against something so thin it was practically invisible. Fishing line, high tensile, transparent wire, stretched perfectly taut across the path at ankle height. Thorne moved up silently behind her, his eyes following the wire to a cluster of rocks on the left. Tucked deep within the crevice, covered expertly in white medical tape, was an old Soviet MON-50 directional mine. It was rigged to a secondary mechanical blasting cap tied directly to the wire. A tripwire, Thorne whispered. Spetsnaz rear guard. They knew we would try for the high ground. He watched Harper pull a small, black multi-tool from her pocket. She didn't cut the wire. Cut a tension wire on a veteran trap was a rookie mistake. Many Spetsnaz traps were rigged with pressure release switches that detonated the moment the tension was lost. Instead, she traced the wire back to the detonator peg with infinite patience. With surgical precision, she used a simple metal safety pin to physically block the firing striker, rendering the mechanical spring completely inert. Only then did she carefully detach the wire. Thorne watched her hands work. He saw the highly specific way she looped the excess wire, a complex figure-8 knot secured with a half hitch to prevent snagging. It was a highly specific piece of intelligence tradecraft. You tie off like a spook, Thorne observed quietly. The early agency used that exact knot to neutralize traps across the Iron Curtain without leaving evidence for the Stasi. My grandfather was Special Activities Division, Harper said, her voice completely flat as she stepped carefully over the neutralized mine. He taught me that when I was 12 years old in the garage, said it was better to know exactly how to walk through the dark than to pretend the monsters weren't there. Thorne felt a profound sense of respect settle deep in his chest. Vance had looked at this girl and seen a liability. Thorne looked at her and saw the unbroken lineage of American warfare. She carried the ghosts of the Cold War in her hands. They reached the wind-blasted summit an hour before dawn. The massive storm was finally breaking, the heavy clouds tearing apart to reveal a sky scattered with cold, indifferent stars. The wind was still howling, but the visibility had dramatically improved to a few hundred yards. Thorne set the heavy radio down on a flat stone, extending the thick rubber antenna toward the sky. He dialed in the emergency frequency, his thick fingers turning the analog knobs with practiced ease. He depressed the heavy transmit button. "Dust off actual, this is Voodoo 10, over." Static hissed back at them, a lonely, empty sound. Thorne waited 10 seconds, adjusting the squelch dial. "Dust off actual, this is Voodoo 10, declaring broken arrow. We are blind and hunted. Requesting immediate extraction at my coordinates. Over." The static crackled loudly, broken by a voice drowning in heavy electronic interference. "Voodoo 10, this is Dust off actual. We read you weak and distorted. Be advised, extraction is a negative. Repeat, extraction is a negative." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Dust off, say again. We have wounded personnel and are actively pursued by hostile Tier 1 elements." The voice on the radio sounded strained, apologetic but firm. "Voodoo, we cannot enter the airspace. AWACS just painted multiple active radar locks from the valley floor. Hostiles are armed with SA-18 Grouse surface-to-air missiles. It is a complete no-fly zone, Master Chief. If we fly in there, we are falling out of the sky in pieces. You are on your own. Godspeed." The radio clicked dead. Before powering down the unit to save its dying battery, Thorne's heavy fingers turned the dial to a classified, completely obsolete frequency. He engaged the automated SOS beacon, a blind, repeating analog pulse cast into the digital void. A desperate message in a bottle that only an old ghost would know how to find. Thorne lowered the handset. He looked at Harper. The silence on the peak was absolute. They were stranded in the graveyard of empires, hunted by Russian mercenaries, with no eye in the sky and no cavalry coming. "We have one option," Thorne said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "The extraction coordinates were 5 miles east of here. Vance hired a private security element to secure the LZ. Apex Defense Group, Western contractors. If they are still at the rendezvous, they have heavily armored vehicles. We link up with them. We drive out of this valley beneath the radar." Harper looked at the map, tracing the route with a cold eye. "It's a long walk down." "Then we better start walking," Thorne said, racking the bolt of his M4. The descent was a grueling, agonizing test of physical endurance. Every muscle in Harper's body screamed for rest, but the iron discipline inherited from her father kept her boots moving forward. Thorne was running on pure adrenaline and combat stoicism, his face a gray mask of pain from the shoulder wound, but his pace never slackened. By mid-morning, the pale winter sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the pristine snow. They reached the valley floor, moving stealthily through a dense thicket of dead, frost-covered trees. Up ahead, Harper saw the glint of metal through the branches. She dropped instantly to a knee, raising her MK-12. Through the optic, she saw 2 heavily modified, matte black armored SUVs parked in a wide clearing. Standing casually around the vehicles were 6 men wearing mismatched tactical gear, heavy plate carriers, and unkempt beards. They were armed with high-end Western weaponry. "Apex," Thorne whispered, lowering his rifle slightly. "That's Graves, the team leader." A large man standing near the hood of the lead SUV raised a hand, holding a radio. He wore a faded baseball cap and a heavy winter coat. He looked precisely in their direction. "Master Chief Thorne," the man called out, his voice echoing loudly in the cold air. It was a distinctly American accent, rough and relaxed. "Man, am I glad to see you. We lost Vance's beacon hours ago, though you boys got swallowed by the mountain." Thorne stepped slowly out from the tree line, keeping his weapon at a low ready. Harper stayed back in the deep shadows, her rifle shouldered, her crosshairs resting squarely on Graves' chest. Trust was a currency she did not spend easily. "We got hit hard, Graves," Thorne called back, closing the distance cautiously. "Spetsnaz element. They jammed the grid and pushed us into the rocks. We need exfil now." Graves nodded sympathetically, resting his hand casually on the pistol grip of his slung carbine. "Damn shame. We heard the chatter on the local bands. Word is the commander and his boys got rounded up, taken to an old facility up the ridge. Thorne stopped 10 yards away, his eyes narrowing. Taken? Not killed? Graves smiled. It was a slow, oily smile that did not reach his cold eyes. You know how it is, Chief. Officers have high value. Ransom, intel. But you? A broken-down frogman and a kid? You're just loose ends. Harper saw the violent shift in Graves' posture a microsecond before it happened. The slight drop of the shoulder, the tightening of the grip on his rifle. "Thorne!" Harper screamed, pulling the trigger. Her bullet tore through the winter air, striking the contractor standing to the right of Graves, dropping him instantly to the snow. But Graves had already moved. He brought his rifle up, aiming not at Harper deep in the trees, but point blank at the wounded Master Chief. Thorne did not try to raise his weapon. There was no time. With the pure instinct of a man who had spent his life shielding others, he threw himself violently sideways, diving toward the snow. Graves fired a rapid 3-round burst. 2 bullets missed. The third caught Thorne squarely in the side of his armored vest, the brutal impact spinning the heavy man around and throwing him violently into a deep snowbank. Harper laid down a furious, deafening volume of suppressing fire, her Mk-12 barking rhythmically. She shattered the bulletproof windshield of the SUV, forcing Graves and the remaining mercenaries to dive frantically for cover behind the massive armored engine blocks. She sprinted from the trees, sliding on her knees into the snowbank beside Thorne. He was gasping for air, clutching his ribs, but his eyes were wide open and furious. The heavy ceramic plate had caught the bullet, but the immense blunt force trauma had cracked his ribs. "They sold us out," Thorne wheezed, spitting blood into the pristine snow. "The Spetsnaz bought their contract. They're making sure nobody leaves the valley alive." Harper peeked over the snowbank. Heavy machine gun fire instantly chewed the ice inches from her face. They were pinned down. 4 heavily armed contractors with armored cover versus 2 battered soldiers in a ditch. "Throw smoke!" Thorne yelled, pulling a grenade from his webbing with his good arm. He yanked the pin and hurled the heavy canister over the snowbank. A thick, billowing cloud of white phosphorus smoke erupted violently between them and the vehicles, blinding the mercenaries. "Move!" Thorne commanded, pushing himself up through pure agony. They scrambled backward, crawling desperately through the deep snow, retreating up a steep, rocky incline that overlooked the clearing. They found solid cover behind a massive fallen oak tree, 300 yards up the slope. Down in the clearing, the smoke began to clear rapidly. Graves was shouting orders, fanning his men out into a wide skirmish line. They were going to sweep the woods. Thorne slumped heavily against the frozen bark of the tree, his breathing shallow and ragged. "I can't make the climb, Spark. My ribs are gone. You need to leave me." Harper completely ignored him. She dropped to her stomach in the snow, deploying the metal bipod of her Mk-12 onto the trunk of the dead tree. She chambered a heavy, match-grade round. She was looking down at the clearing. The distance was immense, nearly 800 yards. The wind was howling across the valley, a relentless, violent crosswind tearing from left to right. "Graves is wearing heavy level 4 armor," Thorne rasped, watching her set up the impossible shot. "And he's staying behind the engine block. You don't have an angle. And the wind is too strong for a 5.56 round at this distance. It will blow your bullet 10 feet off target. You need a ballistic computer to make that math." "I don't need a computer," Harper said, her voice dropping into a state of absolute, chilling calm. She looked through the optic. She didn't have a laser rangefinder. She used the mil dots on her reticle, meticulously measuring the height of the SUV tire, calculating the exact distance through mental arithmetic drilled into her by a Delta Force sniper. 820 yards. She looked at the wind. She didn't have a digital weather meter. She watched the way the lingering smoke drifted. She watched the optical mirage dancing over the hot engine hoods of the SUVs. She watched the snow crystals blowing violently across the valley gap. Wind is a full-value crosswind from the 9 o'clock, she muttered to herself, her thumb manually adjusting the elevation and windage turrets on her scope. Clicks echoing in the silence. Adjusting for bullet drop. Adjusting for spin drift. Adjusting for the aerodynamic jump of the crosswind. Graves stepped confidently out from behind the SUV, raising his binoculars to scan the tree line. He felt perfectly safe. At 800 yards, in a howling blizzard, against a lone shooter with a designated marksman rifle, he truly believed he was untouchable. He believed deeply in the limitations of technology. Harper exhaled. She let the air drain completely from her lungs. The world went silent. The agonizing pain in her frozen fingers vanished entirely. The sound of the wind disappeared. There was only the crosshair, the wind, and the target. She applied 2 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The sear broke perfectly. The rifle roared, bucking violently against her shoulder. At 800 yards, the bullet took nearly 3 full seconds to reach its destination. It fought gravity, dropping precipitously out of the sky. It fought the heavy wind, drifting violently to the right. It carved a perfect, mathematically impossible arc through the freezing air. Down in the clearing, Graves lowered his binoculars. The heavy, match-grade bullet struck him squarely in the bridge of his nose, shattering his skull and dropping him dead into the snow before the supersonic crack of the gunshot even reached the valley floor. The remaining 3 contractors stared at the headless body of their leader in absolute horror. Panic seized them instantly. They didn't know where the impossible shot came from. They didn't know how it was physically possible. Believing they were under heavy fire from a massive sniper team, they broke. They scrambled frantically into the remaining SUV, throwing it into reverse, and tore out of the clearing, abandoning the valley entirely. Silence returned to the mountain. Up on the ridge, Harper slowly, methodically cycled the bolt of her rifle. The smoking brass casing ejected, landing silently in the snow. She engaged the safety. Thorne stared at her. He had seen the greatest military snipers in the world operate. He had seen men who relied on thousands of dollars of digital equipment miss easier shots on a calm day. "Where did you learn to read the wind like that?" Thorne asked, his voice filled with a quiet, profound awe. Harper looked at the old man, a fierce, inherited pride burning in her dark eyes. "My father, Desert Storm." He said the wind always tells the absolute truth, if you know exactly how to listen. She stood up, offering her hand to the Master Chief. He took it, letting her pull his massive frame to his feet. They looked down at the deep tracks left by the Spetsnaz vehicles, leading deeper into the uncharted spine of the mountain. Graves said Vance and the Rangers were taken to a facility, Harper said, her sharp mind already shifting from raw survival to the mission parameters. Thorne looked critically at the tire tracks. The Spetsnaz didn't come here just to kill Americans. They didn't bring EMPs and advanced surface-to-air missiles for a simple ambush. They are actively protecting something. They followed the deep, frozen ruts in the snow for 3 grueling miles, moving like ghosts through the frozen timber. The terrain grew steeper, more unforgiving, until the tracks abruptly ended at the base of a massive, sheer cliff face of solid, unbreakable granite. At first glance, it was just a dead end. But Harper's eyes, trained for years to find lethal anomalies in nature, caught the perfectly straight lines. She pointed silently. 30 feet up the rock face, expertly hidden behind a heavy camouflage net woven tightly with fake snow and dead pine branches, was a seam. A perfectly straight, mechanical seam cut deeply into the mountain. Thorne pulled his binoculars, aggressively ignoring the blinding pain in his ribs. He studied the seam. He saw the heavy steel hinges bolted directly into the rock. He saw the tracks of a heavy rail system leading into the dark interior. "It's a blast door," Thorne whispered, the terrifying realization hitting him like a physical blow. "A Soviet bunker, Object 417. The CIA heard dark rumors about these facilities in the 80s, deep mountain storage depots built by slave labor during the Soviet occupation, designed to survive a direct nuclear strike. Harper studied the perimeter area. There were no guards outside. The Spetsnaz had retreated inside, permanently sealing the heavy steel door behind them, believing the blizzard and their traitorous allies had eliminated any American pursuit. But there was a secondary entrance, a small, heavily rusted ventilation grate situated 50 yards to the left of the main doors, half buried in a massive snowdrift. They moved quickly to the grate. Harper pulled her multi-tool, wedging the thick steel pry bar under the rusted iron frame. With a screech of tearing metal, she violently ripped the grate free. A blast of stale, foul-smelling air hit them in the face. It smelled of old concrete, heavy rust, and something incredibly sweet and sickly. They crawled slowly into the ventilation shaft, dropping down a narrow, claustrophobic concrete chute into the deep bowels of the mountain. They emerged cautiously onto a rusted steel catwalk overlooking a cavernous, subterranean hangar. The bunker was massive, lit by flickering, diesel-powered generator lights that cast long, monstrous shadows against the curved, weeping concrete ceiling. Down on the floor of the hangar, 50 feet directly below them, the Spetsnaz mercenaries were moving with frantic urgency. They were actively operating heavy forklifts, carefully loading something onto heavy armored transport trucks. Harper unslung her rifle, looking through her high-powered optic to get a closer look at the cargo. They weren't loading weapons. They weren't loading gold or intelligence files. They were loading heavy, lead-lined cylindrical canisters. The canisters were incredibly old, painted with faded Cyrillic warnings and a stark, yellow biohazard symbol. Thorne crawled next to her, looking down at the hangar floor. The color drained entirely from his weathered face. "Dear God," the old SEAL breathed. "What is it?" Harper asked, her finger resting cautiously outside the trigger guard. "Vozrozdenia island strain," Thorne said, his voice trembling for the absolute first time since she had met him. "It's a Cold War nightmare. Weaponized anthrax mixed directly with a highly contagious hemorrhagic fever. The Soviets engineered it to wipe out entire cities within 48 hours. There is no cure. The Pentagon thought this entire stockpile was destroyed in '92. He looked at Harper, his eyes burning with a desperate, terrifying intensity. "That is why they bought the contractors. That is why they brought down the drones. They are moving it out of the country. If those canisters reach the open market, millions will die." Harper shifted her optic, scanning the far side of the massive hangar. She stopped, her breath caught sharply in her throat. Tied brutally to steel chairs near the loading bay, bleeding heavily and stripped of all their tactical gear, were Commander Vance and the two surviving Army Rangers. A massive Spetsnaz officer was standing over Vance, viciously pistol-whipping the commander across the face, trying to extract the radio encryption codes. Vance was entirely broken. The man of screens and data was sobbing hysterically, begging for his life. "We have to get them out," Harper whispered, rapidly assessing the tactical situation. There were at least 30 heavily armed mercenaries standing directly between them and the hostages. "We can't," Thorne said, his voice hard, heavy with the crushing weight of a terrible decision. Harper looked at him. "We leave no one behind, Master Chief. That is the code." Thorne grabbed her shoulder, his grip like a mechanical vice. "The code is for soldiers, Spark. This is about humanity. If we engage them to save Vance, we lose the element of surprise. We get pinned down, and those trucks drive out of here. Once that bioweapon leaves this mountain, the world burns." He looked down at the rusty, obsolete nightmare below them. "Our mission just changed. We aren't here to rescue. We are here to destroy. We have to bury this bunker. We have to bring the mountain down on all of us." Harper looked at the tied-up Americans. She looked at the lethal canisters. She looked critically at the heavy structural support columns of the bunker, cracked and weakened by decades of neglect. She reached deeply into her pack and pulled out the heavy canvas bag she had found in an old armory locker near the vent. Inside were a dozen Soviet MON-50 directional mines, packed with high explosives and thousands of steel ball bearings. She looked at Thorne. Her eyes were perfectly dry. Her hands were perfectly steady. The young woman from Fort Bragg was gone. Only the soldier remained. "I'll take the columns," Harper said. "You provide overwatch." Thorne looked at her, knowing with absolute certainty he was sending her to her death. He nodded slowly. "Make them count, kid." Harper checked her pistol. She checked her rifle. She picked up the heavy bag of explosives and stepped seamlessly off the catwalk, descending rapidly into the dark. The descent into the belly of the mountain was a journey backward through time. The rusted iron rungs of the access ladder groaned under Harper's boots, the sound completely swallowed by the cavernous acoustics of the Soviet hangar. The air down here was dead. It tasted of diesel fuel, ancient grease, and the cold, unforgiving dampness of a tomb. Harper Kincaid moved like a shadow detached from the wall. She dropped the last 10 feet, landing in a silent crouch behind a stack of rotting wooden crates stenciled with faded Cyrillic letters. 50 yards away, the Spetsnaz mercenaries were a hive of lethal efficiency. The harsh glare of halogen work lights illuminated the loading bay, casting long, monstrous silhouettes against the curved concrete walls. They were carefully loading the lead-lined canisters of the bioagent into the armored transport trucks. Every single second that ticked by was a step closer to a global catastrophe. Harper did not look at the canisters. She looked exclusively at the architecture. Her explosive ordnance disposal training took over, stripping away the visceral terror of the moment and replacing it with cold, hard mathematics. The bunker was a marvel of brutalist Soviet engineering, but it was incredibly old. Water had seeped through the granite over the decades, causing the heavy iron rebar inside the concrete to rust and actively expand. The structural integrity was catastrophically compromised. She identified 4 massive, central, load-bearing pillars that held up the incredibly heavy, vaulted ceiling of the hangar. If those pillars shattered simultaneously, the millions of tons of solid mountain resting above them would come crashing down, sealing the bioweapons forever under an impenetrable layer of solid rock. She reached into the heavy canvas bag slung across her chest. She pulled out the first MON-50 directional mine. It was incredibly heavy, packed with high-velocity explosives. It was an analog tool for a digital age, and right now, it was the most important object on Earth. High above her, on the steel catwalk cloaked in absolute darkness, Master Chief Silas Thorne lay prone. The pain in his shattered ribs was a blinding white fire, but his hands were perfectly steady. He had his M4 rifle shouldered, the crosshairs of his optic resting squarely on the center mass of the Spetsnaz officer commanding the loading detail. Thorne was the overwatch. He was the guardian angel. He would hold his fire until Harper planted the charges or until she was compromised. Harper slipped out from behind the crates, moving with a terrifying, fluid grace. She crossed the open ground, her boots making absolutely no sound on the oil-stained concrete. She reached the first pillar. Working strictly by touch, she applied strips of heavy military adhesive to the back of the mine, pressing it firmly against a deep vertical crack in the concrete. She bypassed the standard tripwire mechanism, instead wiring a rudimentary, daisy-chained electronic blasting cap deep into the explosive block. She unspooled a length of det cord, running it along the floor, hiding it expertly in the shadowed grooves of the hangar deck. 1 down, 3 to go. She moved rapidly to the second pillar, darting safely behind a parked forklift as a pair of mercenaries walked past, their suppressed rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Harper held her breath, her hand resting heavily on the smooth walnut grip of the M1911 holstered at her hip. The men passed without looking in her direction. She planted the second mine. She wired it. She unspooled the cord. As she moved toward the third pillar, a voice echoed loudly across the hangar, cutting through the low hum of the generator. It was Commander Thayer Vance. He was tied tightly to a steel chair near the armored trucks, his face battered and bleeding profusely. The Spetsnaz officer stood directly in front of him, holding a heavy, blood-stained combat knife. "I told you the encryption protocols," Vance sobbed, his voice cracking with absolute terror. The polished, arrogant officer from Fort Bragg was completely gone, replaced by a broken man terrified of the dark. "The satellite codes will mask your convoy's heat signature from the AWACS. Just let me go. I have clearance. I can authorize a localized extraction that looks like a routine patrol route." Harper froze behind the third pillar. Her blood ran completely cold. Vance was actively selling them out. He was selling out the entire eastern seaboard to save his own skin. By giving them the satellite blind spots, the mercenaries could drive the bioweapons straight out of the Hindu Kush and onto a cargo plane completely undetected. On the catwalk, Thorne heard every single word. The old SEAL felt a deep, sickening wave of disgust. He had seen strong men break under horrific torture, but Vance was volunteering the keys to the kingdom just because he was afraid to die. The Spetsnaz officer smiled, a cruel, jagged expression. He turned away from Vance, pulling a highly advanced satellite uplink terminal from a crate. "Input the codes, Commander. If the sky goes dark, you live." Harper realized the timeline had just accelerated immediately to 0. If Vance inputted those codes, the convoy would leave immediately. She had the third mine in her hand. She slapped it violently against the pillar, jamming the detonator hard into the explosive putty. She turned to run for the fourth and final pillar, the massive central column that anchored the entire facility. She stepped on a microscopic piece of shattered glass. The sound was tiny, a mere crunch, but in the cavernous silence of the hangar, it sounded like a gunshot. The Spetsnaz officer snapped his head around, staring directly into the shadows where Harper crouched. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call out a warning. He raised his rifle and fired a fully automatic burst. Sparks showered violently over Harper as the heavy rounds chewed into the concrete pillar mere inches from her face. Her stealth was completely gone. The ghosts were visible. The massive hangar erupted into absolute, terrifying chaos. High above, Thorne pulled the trigger. His M4 barked, sending a perfect 3-round burst directly into the chest of the Spetsnaz officer. The man dropped dead before he hit the ground. "Contact!" Thorne roared over the deafening echo of gunfire, his voice booming down from the darkness like thunder. "Spark, you are compromised. Move!" 30 elite mercenaries instantly abandoned the trucks and turned their lethal weapons toward the catwalk and the shadows. The air was immediately thick with flying lead, tracer rounds streaking across the hangar like angry, glowing hornets. Harper didn't retreat. She pushed violently forward. She drew the Mk-12 rifle, firing rapidly as she broke from cover, sprinting frantically toward the final pillar. She dropped 2 mercenaries with clean, center-mass shots, her movements entirely devoid of panic. She was a machine operating purely on muscle memory and generations of inherited instinct. A heavy machine gun positioned on the back of one of the trucks opened up, the deafening roar of the heavy-caliber weapon tearing massive chunks of concrete from the floor. Harper dove hard behind a stack of steel beams, pinning her to the ground. On the catwalk, Thorne was taking incredibly heavy fire. The metal grating beneath him was sparking and screaming loudly as bullets ripped through it. He leaned over the rail, utterly ignoring his shattered ribs, and laid down a merciless barrage of suppressive fire. He fired until his bolt locked back, completely empty. He slammed a fresh magazine home, hit the bolt release, and kept firing. He was deliberately pulling the hate of the entire room onto himself so Harper could move. "I'm pinned," Harper yelled into her analog radio, the static breaking her voice. "I'm out of angles, kid," Thorne yelled back. a high-velocity bullet grazing his helmet, violently snapping his head to the side. "They are collapsing on your position." Harper looked out from behind the steel beams. The fourth pillar was exactly 60 feet away, completely exposed in the dead center of the room. Between her and the pillar were a dozen Spetsnaz operators, advancing flawlessly with bounding overwatch. They knew exactly what she was trying to do. They knew she was the detonator. She looked at her MK-12. The magazine was empty. She didn't have time to reload. She dropped the heavy rifle. She reached down to her hip and drew the heavy, Parkerized M1911, her grandfather's gun, a weapon built strictly of cold steel and wood, completely devoid of lasers, microchips, or algorithms. A weapon that demanded terrible intimacy with violence. She pulled the pin on a white phosphorus smoke grenade and hurled it as hard as she could into the open space. The canister popped, instantly spewing a thick, blinding wall of white chemical smoke that burned the eyes and lungs. "Covering fire!" she screamed. She charged directly into the smoke. She did not run blindly. She moved with violent, practiced precision, sliding across the slick concrete beneath the incoming line of fire. A mercenary emerged abruptly from the white cloud, his rifle raised. Harper didn't even slow down. She raised the M1911 and fired twice. The massive .45 caliber rounds hit the man with the force of a sledgehammer, dropping him instantly. She kept moving. The smoke was clearing rapidly, torn apart by the relentless crossfire. She was 20 feet from the pillar. Up on the catwalk, Thorne took a high-velocity round cleanly through his left thigh. The brutal impact spun him around violently, dropping him hard onto the metal grating. His rifle slid out of his reach. He was bleeding heavily, his vision actively swimming. He looked down. The smoke parted. He saw Harper completely in the open. She had the heavy canvas bag of mines strapped to her chest. She was completely exposed, running straight at the central load-bearing column. And he saw the massive, heavy machine gun on the truck track her movement perfectly. Thorne grabbed his analog radio. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized the old man's battered heart. He wasn't looking at a soldier anymore. He was looking at a daughter. "Harper, fall back!" Thorne screamed into the radio, his voice raw, tearing through the baseline hum of the battlefield. "That is an order. You'll die." In the crushing darkness of the subterranean concrete tomb, Harper Kincaid did not fall back. She ignored the order. She charged the enemy with the mines. The heavy machine gun opened fire. The deafening roar filled the hangar. Huge bullets chewed the concrete directly around her boots, tearing violently at her tactical vest. She felt a burning, searing pain tear through her left side, but the massive adrenaline dump and the absolute clarity of her purpose completely blocked the shock. She reached the pillar. She didn't just slap the bag randomly against the stone. Her EOD training calculated the exact blast radius needed in a fraction of a second. She slammed her back against the column, deliberately placing her own body exactly between the incoming fire and the explosives. She jammed the final MUN-50 mine directly into the deepest, most critical structural fracture of the concrete base. She looked across the massive hangar. The Spetsnaz were rushing her, screaming violently in Russian, realizing they could not stop her in time. She looked up into the darkness of the catwalk, where she knew the old Master Chief was bleeding out. She pulled the mechanical clacker from her chest rig. It was wired flawlessly to the entire daisy chain. Harper Kincaid closed her eyes, visualizing the cold wind on the mountains of Montana, the reassuring weight of her father's compass, and the silent, profound pride of a job well done. She squeezed the detonator. The world turned to blinding white fire. The explosion did not sound like a bomb. It sounded like the earth itself tearing completely in half. The simultaneous detonation of the high-yield directional mines completely vaporized the base of all four load-bearing columns. For one microscopic fraction of a second, the unimaginably heavy roof of the hangar hung suspended in the air, actively defying gravity. Then the mountain came down. Millions of tons of solid granite, Soviet concrete, and ancient ice collapsed violently inward. The armored trucks, the bioweapon canisters, the Spetsnaz mercenaries, and the cowardly Commander Vance were instantly crushed, buried forever under a tidal wave of indestructible stone. The floor buckled, the walls disintegrated into dust. The sound was absolute physical trauma. And then there was nothing but a suffocating, terrifying darkness. Silence returned to the graveyard of empires. 6 hours later, the massive snowstorm above the valley finally broke, revealing a pale, freezing dawn. The Black Hawk helicopters that approached did not bear the standard markings of the U.S. Army. They were matte black, flying incredibly low, skimming the jagged peaks. This was a Tier 1 DevGru element, a highly classified SEAL team that had been operating in a neighboring province. They had completely ignored the electronic jamming, having picked up a faint, repeating analog SOS distress signal broadcasted on an obsolete frequency, a frequency only the old guard remembered. They fast roped down to the coordinates, instantly securing the perimeter. They found the ventilation shaft torn open. They rappelled rapidly down into the nightmare below. The hangar was completely gone. It was just a massive, settling mountain of pulverized rubble. The SEAL medics moved with frantic, silent urgency, sweeping the vast debris field with advanced thermal scanners and high-sensitivity acoustic listening devices. They found Master Chief Thorne first. The metal catwalk had collapsed outward, throwing him miraculously into a relatively shallow pile of debris near the wall. He was completely unconscious, bleeding out from multiple severe wounds, his body broken, but his incredibly stubborn heart was still actively beating. They strapped him tightly to a Stokes litter and hauled him toward the sky. The lead medic, a heavily bearded chief petty officer, continued the sweep toward the absolute center of the collapse. He was walking directly over the graveyard of the bioweapons, permanently entombed safely beneath impenetrable rock. His acoustic scanner spiked sharply. It was an incredibly faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. "I have a signal," the medic shouted, dropping to his knees. "Bring the hydraulic spreaders. Now!" 4 heavily armed SEALs rushed to the center of the room. They began digging frantically, tearing away huge chunks of concrete with their bare hands, throwing aside twisted lengths of rebar. They dug through the dust that tasted strongly like copper and pulverized bone. They reached a massive, solid slab of reinforced ceiling that had fallen at an angle, crashing perfectly against the ruined remains of the central pillar. It had created a small, jagged void, a miraculous pocket of life no larger than a coffin. The medics shoved the hydraulic spreaders deep into the gap, pumping the handle furiously. The steel jaws whined loudly, forcing the immense weight of the rock upward by mere inches. The medic shined his tactical flashlight directly into the dark hole. He froze. He dropped his grip completely on the spreaders. Lying in the dust, covered entirely in blood, her tactical gear shredded to ribbons, was Harper Kincaid. Her left arm was broken. Her side was soaked heavily in dark blood. The heavy M1911 pistol was still gripped tightly in her right hand, the slide locked back, completely empty. The medic reached his hand carefully into the void, pressing his fingers gently against the pulse point on her soot-stained neck. Harper took a incredibly slow, rattling breath. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting violently against the blinding glare of the flashlight. She looked at the medic, her vision actively swimming, the heavy dust coating her throat. Her cracked lips parted. Slowly, amidst the absolute ruin of the mountain, amidst the incredible destruction she had willingly brought down upon the enemy, she smiled. "Mission accomplished," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. The medic let out a breath he didn't even know he was holding. "Get the backboard," he ordered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "We're taking our girl home." 6 months later, the warm afternoon sun streamed brightly through the large, immaculate windows of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. The room was incredibly quiet, smelling faintly of antiseptic and fresh linen. Harper Kincaid sat quietly in a wheelchair by the window, looking out over the perfectly manicured lawns. She wore a simple gray t-shirt and loose hospital pants. Her left arm was still resting securely in a sling, and she moved with the careful, highly calculated stiffness of someone whose body had been actively rebuilt with titanium pins and excruciating physical therapy. The door to the room opened with an incredibly soft click. Harper slowly turned her head. Master Chief Silas Thorne walked into the room. He was dressed immaculately in his navy dress blues, the heavy rows of medals on his chest catching the sunlight brilliantly. He walked heavily with a dark wooden cane, his posture slightly stooped from the permanent, agonizing damage to his ribs and spine. But his pale eyes were just as incredibly sharp as ever. They looked at each other for a very long moment. There was absolutely no need for salutes. There was no need for the rigid formalities of rank. They were intimately bound by something incredibly far deeper than the uniform. They were bound by the dark. "You're looking good, Spark," Thorne said, his voice a familiar, low gravel, moving slowly to sit in the armchair beside her. "I'm looking like a walking hardware store," Harper replied smoothly, a faint smirk touching her lips. "How is the shoulder?" "Aches badly when it rains, which means it aches absolutely every single day in Washington," Thorne grunted, resting both of his scarred hands heavily on the head of his cane. He looked out the bright window. The Pentagon formally finalized the after-action report this morning. The bioweapons are permanently sealed. The Spetsnaz element was officially logged as a tragic avalanche during an illegal mining operation. The entire world spins on, and absolutely nobody knows exactly how incredibly close it came to stopping forever. Harper nodded incredibly slowly. "And Vance?" Thorne's heavy jaw tightened perceptibly. "Commander Thayer Vance's remains were recovered near the outer perimeter. The official story is that he died heroically directing fire. But his files, his digital architecture, his entire philosophy of remote-controlled warfare, it took a massive hit. The old guard at the Pentagon is finally waking up. They are aggressively realizing that when the batteries inevitably die, you need people who know exactly how to bleed." He reached slowly into the deep pocket of his dress uniform. "They are giving you the Navy Cross, Harper," Thorne said quietly. "A rare joint service commendation. First female EOD specialist to receive it under these exact circumstances. The ceremony is next month." Harper looked down at her hands. Her fingers, heavily scarred and calloused, traced the edge of the blanket. "I didn't do it for a medal, Master Chief. I did it strictly because it was the job." "I know," Thorne said softly. "That's exactly why you deserve it." He pulled his hand completely from his pocket. He didn't hold a medal. He held out his hand, opening his palm carefully. Resting squarely on his heavily scarred skin was his heavy, brass-cased analog compass. The paint was deeply chipped. The thick glass was heavily scratched, but the tritium dial still glowed brightly with a faint, steady, incredibly reliable light. "My father gave this exact compass to me right before I deployed to Grenada in '83, Thorne said, his voice dropping completely to a whisper. "It got me safely through the jungles of Central America. It got me through the burning deserts of Iraq, and it got me to a radio on a freezing mountain in Afghanistan, so I could call the cavalry for you." He reached over and gently, incredibly carefully placed the heavy brass compass directly into Harper's good hand. "I'm officially retiring tomorrow, Spark," Thorne said, looking her directly in the eyes. "My watch is completely over. The old guard is fading out, but I sleep incredibly soundly, knowing exactly who is standing on the wall." Harper closed her fingers tightly around the incredibly cold brass. She felt the profound weight of it. It was the crushing weight of history, the heavy weight of sacrifice. It felt exactly like the M1911. She looked up at the old man, her eyes shining with an incredible, unspoken reverence. I'll keep it pointed north, Master Chief. Thorne smiled, a genuine, incredibly warm smile that softened the hard, weathered lines of his face. He pushed himself slowly up from the chair, leaning heavily on his cane. I know you will, kid, Thorne said. He turned and walked slowly toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Harper sat completely alone in the quiet room, the warm afternoon sun touching her face. She held the heavy compass incredibly tight in her hand, the needle locking firmly onto the magnetic pole. Outside, the world was moving incredibly fast, entirely obsessed with glowing screens, digital data, and the fragile illusion of control. But Harper Kincaid knew the absolute truth. When the sky inevitably went dark and the monsters came out to hunt, it wouldn't be a computer that saved them. It would be a soldier, a compass, and the courage to step directly into the fire.